Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer JJ Vanilla, here with Drew Conry Murray, and we're here this week to give you some wrap up from several different things that came out. So we have the highlights from the RSA Conference. We have some listener feedback. We have the Verizon DBIR report that came out with some interesting stuff, as well as Google's Mandiant M Trends report from incident response. And then I get on a little bit of a soapbox about security awareness training, and Drew and I hash out a few other details about cybersecurity.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about, but first wanted to let you know about a follow-up, an FU we got from our April News Roundup episode. We had talked about a Fortinet vulnerability where the attacker found a way to maintain read-only access to Fortinet devices, even if the device owner had already patched the original vulnerability. So Fortinet had to release additional updates, and it said that it reached out to affected customers, and we kind of wondered, well, how that might have been done. A listener wrote in to say, Fortinet reached out to the mail addresses that the device support contract was registered on with a notification of device compromised mail that listed the vulnerabilities and the remediation steps. This was possibly the only thing Fortinet could do with the telemetry data they did get from the breached devices. The problem is many end customers didn't buy or didn't renew their support, so many affected devices running the hardware were EOL'd several years ago. To Fortinet's credit, they took a very broad approach to this incident, not discriminating the EOL devices. All devices that had a working mail registered got this mail. So appreciate that follow-up from the listener. JG, do you have any comments? Because I think you were the one who raised the question, like, how did Fortinet actually find all these people?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that work that they did, but part of responsible disclosure is disclosing to the public because especially when you know and acknowledge that you can't reach all of the users and owners and operators of those systems, I do think it's very important to disclose it and do everything you can do with your various partners and customers to help them through that process. But I don't think it does people favors by kind of trying to keep it secret. And I totally get that thinking. I totally get the more that it's out there and the more people know, the more the bad people know. And the idea is to, protect the good people from the bad people by withholding that knowledge. But the thing is, bad actors buy, trade, sell, swap, and share this information.
Yeah.
All over the place. If one of them knows it, they're using it themselves, they're sharing it, they're selling it, or they're using it in conjunction with other actors. And so, my expectation for vendors, especially a security vendor that's at the edge of a network, is communicate early and often and widely.
Well, I would say I don't feel like it was Fortinet trying to hide anything. This did go through usual channels. That's why we were talking about it, because we had heard about it. They did follow up, yeah.
Yeah. Later. I like that early and often thing. And, and we talked to, Omar that had run Cisco PCERT for a long time. And I share their feeling, which is, okay, we know that we're going to be putting information also in some bad actors' hands, but they have access to that anyway. And we think it's more important to disclose this and make it public early so that people can protect themselves.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been well proven that security by obscurity does not work. And in the end, if it turns out you were hiding something and it comes out, that's worse than having had a vulnerability in the first place. So,
Yep.
yeah. All right. So you were at RSA, which happened last week. You were on the program committee for RSA, is that correct?
Yeah.
So you were there in multiple regards. You were there as part of the security community. You were giving some talks. You were on the program committee. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with RSA.
Yeah. So RSA, I think, gets a bad rap because it's commercialized, it's this, it's that, it's big enterprise. And that's true. However, the small team that's like their whole full-time job is content management for this event. And this is their flagship event. They have other events as well, and they have webinars and stuff throughout the year. But the amount of work that this team of people, so, Casey, Britta, Hugh, all these people whose pictures and names you see swirling around related to the conference, it's blood, sweat, and tears for them to put together a program, especially of this size.
I will say one of my previous roles was doing the content for the Interop show back in the day. So I can tell you, yes, people go to events and experience events and they just sort of think it just there, it just happens and it's something you consume. But there's a lot of things that have to happen in the background for any kind of event to be pulled off. So, sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes there's not enough coffee. Sometimes, whatever, you get grouchy because you've been out at a party all night and you're back in some conference room at 8 a.m. and you're like, this sucks. But there's a lot of work that has to go into these kind of things. And I think you're calling that out.
Yeah, so I think they do a great job. They put out their numbers at the end. I think there was like 44,000 attendees, 690 sessions. I'm making these up, but I think they're close. 190 speakers, or it had to have been more than that. I don't know. But it's like large volume, and they do such a fantastic job like pulling the thread between all of the different tracks and types of content, because it's not just sessions. It's not just like people talking and you walk in. There are, of course, there's the expo floor with the vendors. We can talk about that in a minute. I know we had some interesting experiences last year, Drew, when we were there. I did spend less time on the expo floor this year because I went down very surgically to go get a few demos. But that stuff's going on, and the vendors do have their opportunity in special sessions to present their solutions. However, the rest of the content at the conference is curated. Some of it, call for speakers and papers.
Mhm.
But each of these tracks, so my role this year is on the network end. It used to be called the infrastructure and operations track. And we kind of all petitioned, the community, I think, petitioned to RSA saying, look, we don't really have the interop like we did before. There's a lot of security content we need to be talking about in the networking space. Networking can be cloud or on-prem. But this year they changed the track name to networking, and I don't know if it's networking and infrastructure or if it was networking and communication.
But networking is back in that track name.
Yeah, the N word is back. And it's nice because I could tell from prior years we got more networky speakers and content. So, I did a peer birds of a feather session roundtable on, dealing with IoT security in wireless environments. There was a panel with, somebody from Bastille Networks and Aruba HP, and then another person who talked about, non-Wi-Fi wireless protocols and securing that, over the air and protocol analysis. So we're starting to see, the networking content fold back in a little bit. And obviously I'm biased, but that made me really happy, especially in the sea of, AI this and AI that.
Yeah, I think it's important. The premise of this entire podcast series is security and the intersection of networking. So, of course, we are biased toward networking, and glad they're also including Wi-Fi in that as well. So, yeah, happy to see networking explicitly called out because it is an essential part of, your risk management strategy.
Yeah. And then on the expo floor, Drew, right before we were recording, I was telling you one of the things I really loved is like the expo floor went through this weird time period where they got like super fancy booths. There's still big, super expensive booths, but at least the ones that I went to go visit, and again, I was surgical about it, had actual engineers with demos at different stations. So, like I needed to get an update on, Zscaler and what they have done with the air gap networks product that they purchased, right? So they made an acquisition. I had not seen that product since the acquisition. I wanted to understand what they had done and build into it. I was able to find an engineer who worked specifically with that product and talk to that person. Palo's there, Cisco's there, HP Aruba was there. All of our networking vendors were there. And it made me really happy to see that community participating.
Yeah, that's great.
And NetAlly was there. We've talked about the NetAlly and the Cyberscope and Nmap scanning and stuff before.
Right. Yep.
They were there as well.
Yeah. And you also presented at the show, yes?
I did, yeah. So in addition to hosting the Birds of a Feather session, which is just like a pure conversation, the core group of the planning committee that I talked about that's full-time employees of the RSA conference, this year they decided to do a new track called Protecting Home and Family.
Mm.
And so they had Black Cloak, which does like executive protection services, kind of host that day and kick things off. And then they handpicked different speakers and different content. And they asked me to do a home networking security talk with a focus on Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
And, my big dumb butt said yes before I even, I don't do home networking, right? I don't do SMB. I don't do Soho. I don't work in that space other than I have a home and it has a network in it, but I run enterprise equipment here.
Right.
I kind of thought, wow, this is important. We have everybody working from home. We have all of these attack vectors. We have several breaches that we've traced back to home networks.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to just like home systems that are shared or BYOD, actual infiltrations like the whole LastPass thing.
Right.
Was a vulnerability in a Plex server that was sitting in a home network, and the attacker got into there and then pivoted through into another system. So it is important. And I thought, I'm going to have to think about it because you can't do in an enterprise. It's easy. Well, to me, it's easy to say, I know what we need to do. But when you're talking about, you're just working with whatever your ISP gave you, piece of crap CPE router.
Mm-hmm.
What are the really important things when that's your limitation? You don't have VLANs, you don't have over-the-air segmentation, you don't have all of these things. Can we move the needle, and what are the things we should think about? So yeah, I presented this. I'm going to take it and make it into, so the slides are all available. The recording will be available publicly. It usually takes them, several weeks to get all that done. But I want to turn it into a white paper and make it available to everybody. And I'll probably end up hopping over into our Packet Pushers podcast Slack channel and post it there first and get some feedback from the community. I've asked some questions in there of people as I was preparing for this, and you guys were super helpful. So I love that feedback. But, put out a guide with this guidance. But I did it in 3 tiers, basically, which was, the person who just needs their Netflix to work, and they're just going to deal with whatever, AT&T or Google or Spectrum handed them. They're going to plug it in and that's going to be it. So there's some stuff that person can do. And then there's going to be, the person that we called like the DIY home admin, which is probably most of us, you, me, our listeners.
I'm guessing a lot of listeners are that person, yes, and also recruited at family holidays to do it at other people's houses.
Yeah. So all of your friends and family that are asking you what to do, you've got a model for them then with this document. And then, for yourself, varying degrees, but the idea being, we're savvy enough to use more capable equipment. We know what the knobs mean. We have devices that can do VLANs, but we don't want it to be our full-time job. And then there's this third tier of targeted professionals. And this idea that we have people who are very public figures, it could be, just somebody that's famous, an athlete, an actor, or it could be the head of a company who might be targeted, or an executive or a board member of a targeted company. And then how do we extend basically enterprise grade solutions, but more importantly, enterprise grade of visibility and monitoring and alerting to their home and their personal devices as they're moving around and not in the office?
Right, because people like that tend to do a lot of work from home, even if they're not working from home a lot. They tend to be always working. So,
Yeah. And just using their personal devices a lot.
yeah.
So I didn't get into the whole BYOD thing. We do talk about, networking and segmentation. We hit a little bit on, some of the other IoT things like keeping your storage devices patched and things like printers and disabling, direct to print protocols that are on printers. Just, stuff like that. A little bit of, VPNs, when to use what kind of VPN. And then there are some specific product ideas. I'm not even going to call recommendations, but just like this is the class of product that you're probably going to be looking at.
That's cool. Yeah, maybe we should, when you feel like you've got that document together, do an episode on it.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so typically around RSA time, a lot of vendors will release their big sort of, annual security reports. One of the biggest ones is the Verizon, what is it called? The Data Breach Investigations Report that came out. And also Google released its M Trends report, which comes out of its Mandiant business unit. So JJ, you and I have both looked at both of those reports and we wanted to talk about some things that jumped out at us. So I'm going to start, I guess, with the M Trends report, the Google M Trends report. This is the first time I've actually read that M Trends report.
Yeah, me too.
And I found it interesting because it is like the DBIR, it's an industry-wide view, and the Mandiant one is more of a snapshot of organizations that Mandiant has worked with. So it's a smaller data set, but I think in some ways that makes it more targeted, in some ways more interesting. So I think I will just dive in, just some background on it. The information in the report comes from Mandiant's incident response investigations with clients for the calendar year of 2024. Mandiant says the report is based on data collected from more than 450,000 hours of incident response engagements. So a lot of time. And a few starter statistics of the targeted investigations Mandiant conducted in 2024. The highest percentage were in financial services at 17.4%. Again, that's probably reflective of who Mandiant's working with. And the top three industry sectors were financial services, business and professional services, and high tech. Exploits were the most frequently observed initial infection vector at 33% of incidents investigated by Mandiant. Stolen credentials accounted for 16% of the initial infection vector, and email phishing was 14%. Did anything sort of top line jump out at you from the M Trends report?
Yeah, the stolen credentials there. Now they do break out ransomware specifically later, and the initial infection mechanism there is a little bit different. I think it's brute force when you get into that, like a very specific subset, right?
Yep.
But overall, with their incident response, so 16% of those breaches attributed to stolen credentials. I mean, that's an impactful number because
It is when they're also breaking out email phishing specifically.
yeah. So email phishing being its own category there. What this tells me is like we're still, I mean, not surprised, but we're still not doing the basic things. So we're not doing things like managing credential and account lifecycle. We're not rotating those things. And credentials can be different things. So they call this out later in the report, but a credential could be a password that goes along with the username. It could be, other tokens, API keys, things that are used in a more ephemeral way in some of the cloud services.
It sounds like Git repositories are a rich service for finding tokens and other things that help you get access into systems. Yeah.
Exactly. So, probably a lot of this is just straight up, username, password, credentials, but I'm just calling out that credentials could mean other things.
Mhm.
And so we have opportunity with like, certainly your non-human credentials need to be rotated regularly. When you have human-based accounts, multi-factor and those, password rotations, which is kind of funny because we went from this, well, kind of extreme, hey, passwords need to all be long and complex, and we need to rotate them every 90 days. And we backed off of that. And I'm glad we did, but I think we swung too far with the password rotation policy. I do think you still need to update passwords for key services, especially like, if you're in a Google environment, your G Suite stuff, if you're in Microsoft, your 365 stuff, whatever your main IDP is, I think a year is reasonable, but 16% related to stolen credentials that's a big number.
So how do you feel about the rise of password managers, and does that make you feel better about, longer password refresh times?
It's so funny that you asked that because one of the questions I got during the session at RSA was somebody asked, what's better, a password manager or writing on a piece of paper and storing that, notepad inside of your dresser drawer?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think either one is better. I think those are both great because if somebody has gotten into your house and stolen the piece of paper in your dresser, you really got bigger problems than then getting
Yeah.
into one of your accounts unless it's cryptocurrency.
That's always been my thinking as well, yeah.
Yeah. However, I think password managers, when they're used properly, are really meaningful because they're so helpful. Like you need to change your password, you need to make a password, you need to generate it, you need to update it. I don't know about you guys. I have hundreds of passwords in my password managers, and I have, one account for business stuff and a separate account for personal things.
Mm-hmm.
I would not be able to function without it. Now, I know somebody out there is going, well, LastPass. The thing is, first of all, I know we hear in the news, everybody always is like, oh, it was a highly sophisticated attack. This one actually was pretty freaking crafty. It was several attacks that were strung together. Again, it was through a home network. Now, why did a developer have access to production systems for a solution like that, right? A password manager.
Yes.
From a home computer.
Right.
I don't know the answer to that. We may never know. But what I do know from friends that work in this space is, developers are a little bit like little pretty princesses or doctors, or they want what they want and you're going to just do it.
Uh-huh.
So, this is a lesson I think learned for everybody because nobody wants to be that person, right? You don't want to be the person who caused a breach like that. But it happened. The attackers were able to access actual vaults, all of the main portions. And I'm being careful about how I say this because there are parts of LastPass that you don't have to encrypt things. You can store notes and stuff that are not encrypted if you wanted to. But for the most part, if you're talking about username and passwords, those passwords are encrypted and the vaults are encrypted and the password managers don't have your master key. And that's why you're kind of like, you get to be a little bit screwed if you've lost it.
Right.
So is it possible, even with the breach, right? Two separate strings of attacks, got into a personal network, got access to these things, piggybacked on that access, downloaded these vaults. Could they potentially decrypt some or all of that? And then therefore the passwords inside of them? Potentially, yes. Because now LastPass forced, length and complexity and all of this stuff, but it depends on, time and compute power and all that jazz.
Yeah.
So yes, they can eventually be cracked. Is that going to happen in bulk? Probably not.
Right.
Do you have an opportunity now that something has happened to go change those critical passwords? Yes, we've been saying it for over a year.
Yep.
So I feel very good with password managers, even though I do realize it's a little bit of all of the eggs in one basket. There are 2 or 3 passwords that I do not store in vaults. I remember them and that's it.
So the vault is your head, essentially. That's where it's stored, yeah.
But that's like, I can handle that with 2 passwords.
Uh-huh, right.
It's 3, but I can't handle that with, every freaking, manufacturer partner login and Pearson View and this and that login. And yeah, it's just silly.
Yeah, I feel the same way, which is why I actually moved over to a password manager finally.
Fine. Like you just recently did it?
It's been maybe 6 months, and I also have, I guess I shouldn't be saying this, but I do also have things written down on a piece of paper. So
That's fine though. I mean, that I really do think that's fine. Now, I think that it gets to be hard if you're not carrying that thing around with you, because if you log in and it's like, oh, you've got to change your password.
Right.
And your piece of paper is not there with you.
I can take the password manager with me. Yep.
I didn't know you were a holdout. Okay. I'm glad you have come to the dark side.
I'm very old-fashioned. Very old-fashioned.
And I feel, if you're listening to this and wondering, most of these password managers have personal versions that are free or very cheap, and or free if you have. So a lot of them, if you're in a corporate plan, you're also allowed a personal plan up to like whatever, 3 or 5 users.
Mm-hmm.
And I think LastPass is still very strong, especially with, Chris Hoff leading security there now. Keeper, 1Password. I'm trying to think if I'm forgetting everybody. All of these, well-known password managers have personal and corporate solutions, and they're all, I would say, equally good from a security standpoint.
Yeah. All right, we took a little side detour there. I want to get back to the Google. That was my fault too. I asked you about it, but I think it's important. Yeah. Going back to the M Trends report, there's an interesting chart there that's related to dwell time, and dwell time as a malicious actor is inside your network before you find out about it. There's been a precipitous drop. Median dwell time in 2015 was 146 days. In 2024, it's 11 days. If you just look at that chart quickly, you think, wow, all right, the industry's getting really better at this. But the problem is that a lot of that drop is attributable to the rise in ransomware and extortion, where it's actually the attacker who's the one revealing themselves,
Yeah.
sort of skews the number.
Yeah, yeah. What is that correlation versus the causation sort of thing
Exactly.
there? Yeah, I thought the same thing.
Yeah, so it looks like progress, but the news is still generally, I think, pretty good because Mandiant does break out another chart on dwell times broken out by detection source. And the medium dwell time for an adversary revealing themselves is 5 days. So that's the adversary saying, haha, I encrypted your stuff, give me money. For internal detection, the median time is 10 days. Okay, so that means internal detection is you figured it out. And for external entity to notify the target, it's 26 days, meaning like law enforcement or a security consultant or somebody outside the organization told you. 26 days, not great, but still way better than 146 days. So it does seem like we are improving.
So let me point out two things here. So I know you led in with this, but this is a Mandiant report.
Yep.
Mandiant is now part of Google, but before that, they were kind of the go-to incident response organization, probably in the world.
Yep.
So if you figure that Mandiant's getting called in for incident response, it's because somebody knows something has happened. So I think there's some bias in this, and that, yes, because these are the companies that have the detection and have already engaged in a retainer with Mandiant or somebody like that, right? So I think it would be interesting to look at the peer type of numbers from the Verizon breed.
Well, I did. Did
you now? And also, I did just notice reading this, it says median dwell time.
Yes.
Not average dwell time, because if you look at some of the other, numbers that they have, is like there's still 13 to 20% that are months or into years
Right.
of detection. So median is the middle value in a sorted data set, while the average is the average.
Right.
So that's a little misleading.
Yeah, the people on the other half of that median side, it could be 1,000 days, and we don't know. So yes, but still, as a median number, that means half of the people are at that number or lower. So I feel like, okay, good. So yeah, I did also look in the Verizon report to see if they talked about dwell time. They do. And where are those numbers? Yeah, so this is the Verizon DBIR. When you take out, again, the threat actor disclosing themselves, which they said was 96% of the incidents they are reporting on, the numbers are still not bad. So again, we're talking median numbers. Median dwell time for a non-actor disclosure was 24 days in the Verizon DBIR report. In 2022, it was 30 days. So yeah, 24 days.
Okay.
Not bad. And that kind of tracks with what Mandiant found as well. So
yeah. All right. I'm okay with it then.
Yeah. Anything else on the Mandiant report you wanted to talk about?
There were a couple of little, maybe footnotes more than anything else. So they did have around page 11, the most frequently exploited vulnerabilities. I was a little bit surprised to see PanOS Global Protect above both of the Ivanti bugs. And I think coming in fourth was a FortiClient EMS server SQL injection vulnerability. So that kind of surprised me. Now, I don't know the context of what else. I'm guessing that's initial entry. That would make sense.
Yeah, they said it was the most frequently exploited vulnerabilities in its 2024 investigations, and there was a vulnerability in PanOS Global Protect that I guess Mandiant tracked about a dozen active exploits against that after a zero-day attack. I was surprised to see one Mandiant naming names because I don't think the Verizon report does that, but they tied these vulnerabilities directly to the responsible vendor. So as you mentioned, Palo Alto Networks was in there, Avanti had 2, and then Fortinet had 1.
Yeah, some of the Verizon stuff does. It depends on the content and the context, I think. So the last couple little notes on the Google report, around page 18, they talked about malware, and they're tracking, 600 and some net new malware families in the year, which just seemed like a huge number. And it was interesting to see the trending going of, yes, a lot of that is Windows, but there is a pretty steep incline for both Linux and Mac being targeted in malware as well. And I think, I mentioned that just because one of the things I think, carried over from over a decade ago that I still hear is people go, oh, I don't need fill in the blank. I don't need whatever on my Mac. I don't need antivirus. I don't need endpoint detection software. I don't need, right? There's no viruses for Mac. There's no vulnerabilities for Mac, whatever. That's not true anymore. So I think especially in a corporate environment, because one of the things I saw, actually, I was going to piggyback on something you said in this Google report, that there was some interesting related number in the Verizon report. Okay, so around page 12 of the Verizon report, it talks about stolen credentials. So stolen credentials was one of, but not the top initial entry mechanisms in the Verizon report. But an interesting thing there was personal versus corporate. So they actually did analysis on the info stealer logs. So, basically when you get malware on a computer, it sends logs, and I guess they got a hold of that and analyzed that.
Mhm.
So 30% of the compromised systems had some type of like enterprise licensing. So maybe a corporate device, but maybe not a corporate device, maybe just a corporately enabled personal device. But almost half of those were not managed and had both personal and business credentials commingled on them.
Mhm.
So that kind of screams to me, BYOD, whether somebody means to have a BYOD program or not. But because I do, work so much with organizations who are trying to figure out what to do with BYOD, should they allow BYOD, et cetera, that was a pretty alarming statistic, especially when you think back at these numbers where we're talking about 15 to 20% of these initial entry vectors coming through stolen credentials.
Mhm.
How are these credentials stolen? Well, people put stuff on computers and then they harvest that and they go sell it on the black market.
Right. Yeah, so just to set some context around the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, or DBIR, it comes out every year. Is it decades now that it's been coming out? Been a while.
My God, a long
A
time.
long time. In any case, this year the report shares information drawn from 12,195 confirmed data breaches, and they say it's the highest number they've ever analyzed in the report.
Mm.
For general highlights, credential abuse was the leading vector of initial access at 22% of breaches. That's actually different from Mandiant. Mandiant, it was exploits that were the top cause, the leading vector. But however, in this DBIR report, vulnerability exploitation is catching up. It was responsible for 20% of initial access, and that's up 34% over last year. So vulnerability exploits seemingly catching up in the DBIR report, whereas Mandiant is seeing primarily vulnerability as opposed to credential theft. Ransomware was present in 44% of breaches reviewed in the report, a 12% increase over last year. And note that the DBIR report includes both encrypting ransomware and non-encrypting extortion as a ransomware event. So take that however you want.
Interesting.
So we compared, the dwell time numbers from the two reports. Something else jumped out at me in the Verizon report. They looked at not only was it the actor revealing themselves or somebody on the inside or outside who found it, they looked at how the discovery was made for, if you or somebody else found it, and it wasn't just the attacker revealing themselves. Infrastructure monitoring led the named categories at 18%, and reported by an employee was 14%. So infrastructure monitoring and employees reporting it were the two biggest ways that these intrusions were alerted to internally.
Oh, fantastic.
That beat out antivirus software, it beat out log reviews, it beat out law enforcement. So I thought it was interesting because there's, I think, a significant debate in the security industry about how much employee training really matters. And to me, 14% being reported by an employee beating out antivirus software seems like, well, yeah, maybe that is worth a little bit more investment or continuing investment if you're doing that.
I have to wonder now, and this is where I think Google does a little bit better job in explaining specifically the meaning.
Mhm.
Reported by an employee. That doesn't mean it was found and stopped by an employee, but it could be an employee tried to log into the system, right? They got the lock screen. They had some indication that the system was compromised, whether it was a computer or infrastructure
Mhm.
or something in the cloud, and then they reported that basically this thing just got hacked.
Okay, so you're saying it wasn't an employee being like, I think we got hacked. It was an employee saying, I can't access this. And somebody got that ticket and was like, oh, wait, this is a bad thing. Yeah, I guess
I don't know.
that could be part of the explanation. That's a good point.
Yeah, because it says how the discovery was made. And again, this is where I think like the Mandate report does some good jobs. Down the sides, they give you like what do they mean by when they say, certain phrase or word, or how are they categorizing that? Verizon might have a appendix that I haven't, gotten to because these documents are
They're long.
hefty. They're both around 100 pages. Now, I mean, a lot of that's kind of supporting material, so don't be put off by it. I think there's a lot of interesting data to be ingested in these.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I know. I'm a fan. It's so funny. We had this debate, I don't know, probably 6 times with different people at RSA this year
Mhm. About employee training?
about, yeah, security awareness training. I'm a fan of security awareness training
Mhm.
because, okay, soapbox, don't let me go for more than about 45 seconds
I
here.
started the timer.
but because it's your opportunity, not just like, let me buy these cheap little stupid cute memes, and make people watch these videos. It's a great opportunity, if you're doing it right, to create content that reinforces your corporate security policy, your policy about what you expect of your employees for acceptable use, personal devices, commingling of accounts, et cetera, and educating them on your policy instead of just educating them about the threats. I think both are good because the number of people that don't work in tech and security that have said, "Oh, I think these little corporate, security awareness training videos I get at work are so good. I share them with my kids and my teenagers."
Uh-huh.
So that tells me they're helpful and they're well received. However, phishing simulation can go suck on a fat egg. Like, it can just burn in hell and go away, and I would be fine.
Okay. What is it about the phishing simulations you don't like?
Because it's somebody, malicious or not, will always be able to phish somebody else.
Mhm.
There's too many different ways to do it, through social engineering, through email compromise, et cetera, et cetera. If I sent you an email or a Slack message, Drew, and told you to click on or download something, you would do it.
That's true, I would.
But you have no way to know that that wasn't somebody that had compromised one of my accounts, or made up something. If I emailed you from a Gmail account or an Outlook account or something, and I said, "Oh, this is too big for me to send from my corporate account, but here, I wanted you to have this report because I already downloaded it."
Mhm.
So my point is like, heck, I've clicked on stuff, right? Now, the endpoint software, yeah, I'm just fine. We're all going to click on stuff. And it's impossible to train your people, especially in a world where we have so many different partners. And it's like, oh, this is the company that manages our HR thing. And this is the company who administers our benefits program and the healthcare program, and then this program, and where we get our email content management stuff from. It's just too much. And so you'll always be able to get somebody to click on something. And then there's no way to really track, okay, they clicked on something. Well, how? First of all, we accidentally click on stuff. I accidentally click on all the time, phone, laptop, whatever.
Right.
But it's just not helpful because you don't know, was it a stupid thing that was obviously phishing? I've seen lots of examples of these over the years. We used to sell and integrate this software. I have lots of friends that use it, so they send examples. So some of them are just like generic, and some of them are very specific and targeted. If we tracked at that level to kind of understand more as a metric for understanding the awareness of our users, are they seeing the obvious stuff and reporting it or whatever, versus these highly targeted, customized things? Because those are two different metrics and two different measurements.
Yeah.
The other thing that I have recently learned is anybody on a Microsoft platform, corporate, if you're using 365, Microsoft voluntells you will use Defender's email security.
Mhm.
They don't give you an option. If your mail passes through their server, they are doing Microsoft-y email security things on it.
Mhm.
In addition to, and superseding at times, the actual email security platform you intended to use that you have your mail routed through. And so then what happens is you also can't aggregate all of this together because you can't turn off the Microsoft thing currently. Now, I am obviously advocating for better control over that because it's really messing up the people that do have structured, and I would say more mature phishing campaigns, which I don't like, but the people that are doing it and doing a relatively good job with it, they can't even get meaningful metrics because of this. Anybody that's using Microsoft has this other thing going on, and it has its own quarantining and reporting features in addition to the one that you intended to use. So it's just a mess.
Yeah. That does sound like a mess. Yeah, I will say I take your point that if you are going to do this, it's probably best to build it internally if you can, if you have the resources, and target it toward your own security policies and practices as opposed to some canned thing that's probably going to be very lame and eye-rolling and people won't pay attention to. And I also understand that if you've got a 10,000 employee organization, that's going to be really hard to roll out, targeted security training.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, difficult problem, but these results that we're talking about in this report make me think it could be worth, though, your time and some time and investment. If it's something that you are already investing in now, maybe you can go to the folks who are begrudgingly giving you that budget and saying, look, I think here's some evidence that maybe this is effective, or as a spur to help you get some more budget for this. And also we did an episode with Joe Stern, who runs IT for a small business. He, I think, is very successful in doing security awareness training with end users. And he's got some good tips on how to do it and make it, interesting and effective and useful and not just punitive. So I'll have the link in the show notes to that episode.
Now that you mentioned that, it's funny. So during RSA, they recorded an episode. Andy and his co-host recorded an episode of the CISO series podcast. Mm-hmm. So Andy Ellis, who we've had on here before, I think, haven't we?
The name's not familiar, but coming up on like 60 episodes. So.
You do so many podcasts, Drew. I don't think you even know which day of the week is what.
Who are you? Where am I?
So Andy Ellis used to be the CISO at Akamai, and I'm sure everybody that works in tech is familiar with Akamai and what they do with basically running the internet and content distribution, et cetera.
Yep.
So large organization, highly targeted, et cetera. I think he probably feels similarly. He might even have a stronger opinion about phishing simulations. Like this is where you get into like compliance requirements versus the spirit of security
Yep.
and actually moving the needle.
Yep.
So he said on the podcast recording that they were doing during RSA, he literally got rid of their entire phishing platform thingy, put up a web server with a web page on it that said whatever it had to say per the compliance requirements, and then like had everybody go click on that. Now, that sounds pretty extreme. If you know Andy, you might know that that's, even though it sounds extreme, it is probably exactly what happened. Maybe during one of the Ask a CISOs, if we haven't had him on, we'll have him on because he definitely has some great insights and strong, very entertaining feelings about some of this.
I would like to hear that. Yeah, let's see if we can bring him in. All right, well, we'll have links in the show notes if you want to go get these reports for yourselves. I do think they are worth exchanging some of the information you have to give up to get them because there's a lot of information. You could spend a lot of time with both of these reports, particularly, I think, DBIR. It's just got so much detail. Anyway, links in the show notes plus other things that we talked about. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If you have a topic you want us to cover or a comment or a correction or a question, you can reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. We do appreciate when listeners reach out, and if you're willing, we can include your response on the air. By the way, Packet Protector is part of the Packet Pushers podcast network. That network includes a dozen technical podcasts for your professional development on networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, and more. There's an industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters, a community Slack group, a YouTube channel, even an IRC group. You can find everything at packetpushers.net, all free with no login required. Stay safe out there.